What does it mean for a boy to carry a river? Is it a myth, a legend whispered on a dry wind? Or is it the story of a burden so heavy it could carve canyons into a child's soul? This is the story of that boy, and the river he carried was not one of water, but of memory, of injustice, and of a thirst so profound it threatened to turn his heart to dust. It all began under the oppressive eye of a sun that had forgotten how to be gentle. In this land, the sky was a sheet of hot white steel, and the earth was a mosaic of cracks. A thirsty mouth opened in a silent, endless scream. Life clung on by a thread, and that thread was held in the fist of one place, the Andrade Ranch. Its gates were tall and made of black iron, twisted into patterns that looked more like warnings than welcomes. Beyond them, you could see a sliver of impossible green, a defiant splash of life that mocked the dying world outside. It was an oasis built on the back of a desert, a fortress that hoarded the land's last drops of hope. To these gates came a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, a small, fragile figure drawn in lines of dust and desperation. His name was Leo, and he was the ghost of the land's poverty, a whisper of what happens when everything is taken away. He was barefoot, and the soles of his feet were as tough as old leather, but the ground was so hot it felt like he was walking on embers. His clothes were little more than patched together. Rags and his face streaked with the grime of a long journey was a canvas of silent suffering, but it was his eyes that told the whole story. They were wide and dark, and in their depths was a thirst that went far beyond the physical. It was a thirst for a life he barely remembered, a thirst for a world that didn't see him as a nuisance, a piece of human debris to be swept aside. He stood before the immense gate, a sparrow before a monolith, and gathered what little strength he had left. His voice, when it came, was a dry rasp, barely louder than the rustle of the parched leaves on the skeletal trees nearby. He did not ask for food. He did not ask for money. He asked for the one thing the Andrade Ranch had in abundance, the one thing the rest of the world was dying for. He asked for a single cup of water. The silence that followed his plea was heavy, thick with the afternoon heat. For a moment, it seemed as if the world had stopped breathing, waiting to see if this small act of desperation would be met with mercy. Then a smaller gate within the larger one creaked open, and a man emerged. This was Silas, the ranch foreman. He was a man carved from the same hard, unforgiving material as the land itself. His face was a roadmap of cruelty, with eyes that held no light, only a cold, flat judgment. He looked down at Leo, his lip curling into a sneer of contempt. A boy begging for water was not a tragedy to him. It was an insult, a stain on the perfect, orderly world he managed for his master. Silas let out a short, guttural laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. He didn't speak. Instead, he took a deliberate step forward, hawked, and spat on the ground, a thick glob of moisture landing in the dust just inches from Leo's bare feet. The message was clearer than any words. "What you beg for, I waste. You are worth less than the dirt I spit on." Leo flinched, his small body recoiling as if struck. The act of spitting was a profound violation, a gesture that stripped away the last vestiges of his dignity. Shame, hot and bitter, flooded his senses, momentarily eclipsing even his thirst. Before he could react, before he could even process the depth of the cruelty, Silas moved. With a guttural curse, he shoved Leo hard in the chest. The boy was so light, so brittle from hunger and dehydration, that he stumbled backward and fell, his small frame hitting the unforgiving ground with a soft thud. He landed in the dust, the same dust that had just been desecrated by the foreman's spit. And then came the sound, the terrible, final sound of the iron gate slamming shut. It wasn't just a click, it was a clang, a deep, resonant boom that echoed across the silent landscape. It was the sound of a door being shut on humanity. It was the sound of absolute power, of merciless denial. The sound vibrated through the ground, through Leo's bones, sealing him outside in a world without water, without kindness, without hope. He lay there for a long time, the dust clinging to his damp cheeks where a single tearless sob had escaped him. The sun beat down on his back, but he no longer felt its heat. All he felt was a coldness spreading from within, a chilling realization of his own insignificance. He was nothing. A stray dog would have earned more consideration. The gate stood before him, impassive and final. It was more than a barrier of iron. It was a symbol of the world he was now trapped in, a world where the rich drank deeply while the poor choked on dust. The dry earth beneath him became his only companion. It was as cracked and broken as he felt, as thirsty for relief as his own parched throat. This land, this very soil, it understood his pain. It had been suffering this same neglect, this same agonizing thirst for years. He pressed his small hand against its surface, feeling the fine particles of dirt, and for a moment he felt a strange connection, a shared agony between the boy and the ground he lay upon. And you, who are watching this story unfold, have you ever felt a thirst like that? I don't just mean for a cup of water on a hot day. I mean a thirst for a drop of kindness in a world that has turned its back on you. Have you ever stood before a closed door, knowing that everything you needed was on the other side, and been told, not with words but with an action, that you were not worthy of even being acknowledged? Have you ever been judged, dismissed, and made to feel so small that you almost disappeared into the cracks of the earth? It is a pain that goes deeper than bone, a shame that can poison the very will to live. It is the feeling of being utterly and completely alone, a ghost in a world that refuses to see you. If you have ever felt that, then you know the desolate landscape that was Leo's heart in that moment. You understand the silence that followed the clang of that gate. But this story is not just about a boy and a gate. It is about what happens when a spirit, pushed to the very edge of extinction, refuses to break. Slowly, painfully, Leo pushed himself up. His limbs ached, his head spun, but a new feeling was beginning to smolder beneath the layers of shame and despair. It was a tiny ember of defiance. He would not die here. He would not let the foreman's spit be the last thing he tasted. He would not let the clang of that gate be the final word in his story. He turned his back on the Andrade ranch, its mocking green a blur in his vision, and began to walk. He didn't know where he was going, not really. He was just moving, putting one foot in front of the other, propelled by a force he didn't understand. Each step was an act of rebellion. Each breath of dusty air was a refusal to surrender. He was walking away from the ultimate symbol of power in the region. But what was he walking toward? What hope could possibly exist in a land so thoroughly bled dry, so completely under the thumb of the very people who had just cast him out like trash? This is the question that hangs in the air, thick as the dust itself, because a boy so small, so utterly powerless, cannot change the world. He cannot make the rains come. He cannot tear down iron gates. Or can he? What no one knew, what Silas in his casual cruelty could never have imagined, was that this boy was not just a beggar. He was a vessel of a history that ran deeper than any well the Andrades had ever dug. He was the last living memory of a time before the dust, a time when the land had a different name, different master. His journey was taking him through the village, a collection of sun-bleached adobe houses that seemed to huddle together for protection against the harshness of the sky. But there was no protection here. The village was a microcosm of the world Leo had just experienced. It was a place living in the shadow of the ranch, its people surviving on the scraps of employment and favor thrown to them by Colonel Andrade. They saw Leo pass, a small, dusty apparition, and their eyes slid away. They saw not a child in need, but a problem, a potential disruption to the fragile balance of their own survival. To help him would be to risk the colonel's displeasure, and no one was willing to take that risk. Every closed door, every averted gaze, was another small nail in the coffin of his hope. They were reinforcing the foreman's message: "You do not belong. You are nothing." The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brutal streaks of orange and purple, the colors of a fresh bruise. The heat lessened, but a different kind of cold began to creep in. The cold of the night, the cold of absolute isolation. Leo kept walking, past the last of the silent houses, his shadow stretching long and thin behind him. He was leaving the world of men behind, a world that had offered him nothing but contempt and indifference. His destination was a place of ghosts, a place of endings. He was heading toward the skeletal remains of an old farmhouse, a collapsed structure of rotting wood and crumbling stone that stood alone on a barren plot of land. It was a place of deep and profound sorrow, the grave of a life he once knew. It was the ruins of his own home. He walked not with hope, but with the instinct of a wounded animal seeking a familiar place to lie down. He believed he was going there to fade away, to let the dust he was born from finally reclaim him. The structure was silhouetted against the dying light, looking like the ribcage of some great beast that had perished. From thirst long ago, the air grew still, and the silence was broken only by the sound of his own bare feet crunching on the dry, sterile ground. He was a boy returning to the scene of a great tragedy, drawn by the faint echo of a lullaby and the ghost of his father's laughter. He did not know it yet, but he was not walking toward his end. He was walking toward his beginning. Deep beneath that dust, buried under the weight of his family's failure and forgotten by the world, a secret was waiting. It was a secret that had been silent for generations, a truth written in faded ink, sleeping in the dark. It was a secret that had the power to change everything, to turn the dust into mud, to make the desert bloom, to drown an empire of greed in a flood of justice. As Leo, the boy who was denied a single cup of water, took the final steps toward the ruins of his past, he was unknowingly walking toward a future where he would not just ask for water. He would become its source. The ruins of his home did not welcome him. They stood as a collection of broken teeth against the bruised twilight sky, a monument to a life that had been chewed up and spat out by the merciless land. This was not a sanctuary. It was a tomb. And Leo, its last mourner, had returned to lie down amongst the bones of his past. He stepped over the collapsed threshold, a doorway that once held the promise of his mother's embrace, and the dust rose in lazy swirls around his feet, disturbed from a long, settled grief. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay, of sun-baked wood and the ghosts of forgotten meals. Every shadow held a memory, every splinter of wood a story. He was a boy of 10, yet he carried the history of a man of 80, a weight that pressed down on his small shoulders, threatening to grind him into the very dust he now stood upon. This place had not always been a skeleton. Leo closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, the oppressive silence was filled with echoes. He could almost hear the rhythmic creak of the old wooden porch swing, where his mother, Elena, would sit in the evenings, her voice a soft melodic thread, weaving stories of the stars into the fabric of the night. Her songs were about the land, about the promise of rain, about the resilience of the families who worked the soil. She sang of a world where hard work was always rewarded, where the earth was a partner, not an adversary. He could almost feel the phantom coolness of the evening breeze that used to carry the scent of damp earth and blooming night flowers, a perfume that had long since been replaced by the sterile, choking scent of unending drought. That world felt as distant as the moon, a fairy tale told to a child who no longer had the luxury of believing in such things. His father, Ricardo Martin, was a man made of that same earth his wife sang about. He was quiet, with hands as calloused and cracked as the soil he tilled, but those hands were capable of a tenderness that defied their rough exterior. Leo remembered sitting on his father's lap, watching as those large, gentle hands would patiently show him how to read the clouds, how to feel the subtle shifts in the wind that hinted at a coming storm. Ricardo didn't speak of love in grand pronouncements. He spoke it in lessons. "The land remembers, Leo," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "You treat it with respect, you give it your sweat and your faith, and it will remember you when you are hungry." He taught Leo the names of the native grasses, the patterns of the birds, the deep, silent language of a world that was in balance. To be a Martin was to be a part of this land, not a master of it. It was a legacy of stewardship, a quiet pride passed down through generations. But then, the sky began to forget them. The drought did not arrive like a sudden storm. It was a slow, creeping thief. At first, it was just a few mist rains, a sun that seemed to burn a little hotter each day. The vibrant greens of their small farm began to fade to a tired yellow, then a brittle brown. The creek at the edge of their property, once a lively ribbon of silver, shrank to a muddy trickle and then disappeared entirely, leaving behind a scar of cracked mud. The land, their partner, was growing silent. Ricardo's quiet confidence began to fray at the edges. He would spend hours staring at the blank, white sky, his shoulders slumped, as if he could will the clouds into existence through sheer force of will. The balance was broken, and with it, the spirit of the man who had taught Leo to believe in it. The earth was no longer remembering them. It was turning its back. The nights became the hardest. The comforting sounds of crickets and frogs were replaced by a dead, oppressive quiet. Leo would lie in his small bed, pretending to be asleep, and listen to the whispered conversations of his parents from the other room. Their words were strained, tight with a fear they tried to hide from him. Words like credit, bank, and foreclosure were new and terrifying sounds. He didn't understand what they meant, not fully, but he understood the sound of his mother's muffled sobs and the heavy, defeated sighs of his father. The drought wasn't just killing their crops, It was poisoning the air inside their home, turning their love and partnership into a landscape of fear and desperation. The cracks in the earth were mirrored by the cracks forming in the foundation of their family. Then came the morning that broke the world. His father stood by the door holding a small, worn bag. He knelt down in front of Leo, and for the first time, the boy saw a look in his father's eyes that scared him more than the dying land. It was the look of a man who was already a ghost. "I have to go to the city," Ricardo said, his voice rough. "There's work there. I'll send money. I'll be back before the next rain, I promise." He hugged Leo tightly, a desperate, crushing embrace that felt like a goodbye, and then he was gone, a solitary figure walking down the dusty road, not once looking back. Leo stood on the porch and watched until his father was just a small speck, swallowed by the shimmering heat haze. The next rain never came, and neither did Ricardo Martin. After that, his mother began to fade. The songs stopped completely. She moved through the house like a shadow, her body present but her spirit gone, journeying down that same dusty road her husband had taken. She still cared for Leo, making sure he ate what little they had, but the light in her eyes had been extinguished. The illness that took her was born of a broken heart and a withered hope. She was a flower that had been uprooted, and she simply could not survive without her soil. Leo watched her shrink, just as he had watched their creek shrink until there was almost nothing left. The drought had taken his father, and now it was taking his mother. It was a relentless, patient monster, consuming his entire world, one piece at a time. On her last day, she was too weak to get out of bed. She pulled him close, her hand a fragile, bony thing on his cheek. Her breath was a shallow whisper. "Leo," she said, her voice barely audible, "this land, it knows us. It remembers the Martins. Don't you ever let anyone tell you that you don't belong here. The truth is in the dirt. It never forgets." Those were her final words, a cryptic inheritance of dust and memory. After she was gone, Leo was truly alone, a child adrift in a sea of silence, clinging to the wreckage of a home that was no longer a home, and a piece of land that had forgotten how to give life. The earth had taken everything from him. Have you ever returned to a place that only exists in your memory? A place where the ghosts of laughter and love are more real than the crumbling walls that stand before you? You walk through the empty rooms, and you can see it all. The life that once filled the space, the people who are gone, but who have left their imprint on the very air. It is a pain unique to the human heart, to stand in the present and be overwhelmed by the past, to feel the crushing weight of everything that has been lost. This was the world Leo now inhabited, a world where memory was both his only comfort and his greatest tormentor. He was the sole keeper of a history that the rest of the world was eager to bury and forget, and the world was indeed forgetting. Just over the rise, visible from the highest point of his family's barren land, was the Andrade Ranch. It was a different universe. While the Martin farm had withered, the Andrade estate had flourished, its fields a vibrant, mocking green. It was an oasis in the heart of a desert, and its existence felt like a personal insult, a constant reminder of his family's failure. Colonel Andrade was a name spoken in the nearby village with a mixture of fear and reverence. He was a man who had seemingly tamed the sun, who commanded water to flow where he willed it. He was power incarnate. The villagers saw his prosperity not as a mystery, but as a sign of his superiority. He was a man who had won the war against the sky, while men like Ricardo Martin were its casualties. This power dynamic poisoned the entire community. The village was a collection of people living on their knees, dependent on the scraps of work and favor the colonel threw their way. Survival had replaced compassion. When Leo first found himself orphaned, he had tried to seek help there. He remembered knocking on the door of the Garcias, a family who had shared many meals with his parents in the better times. Mrs. Garcia had opened the door a crack, her eyes darting nervously toward the road. She saw him, saw the hunger and grief in his face, and her own face had crumpled with a pity she could not afford to show. "We can't, Leo," she had whispered, before gently closing the door. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was fear. To help the son of a failed farmer was to risk being seen as one of them, to attract the wrong kind of attention from the big house on the hill. The gossip followed him like a stray dog. He would hear the whispers as he passed. "That's the Martin boy. Poor thing. His father had too much pride. They say Ricardo just ran off, left his wife and kid to starve." They should have sold their land to the colonel when they had the chance. Each whisper was a small stone thrown at his dignity. They were rewriting his family's story, turning a tragedy of nature into a failure of character. It was easier for them to believe the Martins were weak than to confront the terrifying reality that the same fate could befall any of them, that their own survival was hanging by a thread held in Colonel Andrade's hand. And so Leo became an outcast, a living symbol of a fate they all dreaded. He sat now on the floor of what used to be the kitchen, the very heart of his home. The sun had completely vanished, and the ruins were plunged into a deep, starless dark. A cold wind snaked through the broken walls, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the hollowness inside him. He had come here with a vague, desperate plan to simply stop, to lie down and let the world finish what it had started. He was tired of fighting, tired of the hunger, tired of the memory of his mother's face and the shame of the foreman's spit. He was the last Martin, a name that now meant nothing but dust and failure. He was the boy who carried the ghosts of a farm, a father and a mother, and the weight was finally becoming too much to bear. He huddled against the remains of an old stone hearth, seeking some small shelter from the biting wind. The stones were cold, but the earth beneath them felt different. A strange, deep coolness seemed to emanate from the ground itself, a cold that felt older and more profound than the chill of the night air. He pressed his palm against the packed dirt floor, feeling the faint vibration of the world's deep, slow heartbeat. He thought of his mother's last words. "The truth is in the dirt. It never forgets." He had thought it was just the fevered rambling of a dying woman, a final piece of poetry to comfort a frightened boy. He believed he had come to this place to be forgotten, to finally let go of the past that haunted him. But what if the past was not done with him? What if the ground he was lying on, the very dirt that had swallowed his family's dreams, was not a grave, but a vault? He had come to the end of his story, or so he thought, but a new chapter was about to begin, not written in the sky or in the hearts of men, but in the deep, dark, secret memory of the earth itself. What truth was sleeping beneath his feet, waiting for the touch of a boy who had lost everything? The answer was closer than he could ever imagine, and it had the power to change not only his fate, but the fate of the entire valley. The night was far from over. The cold stones of the hearth offered no comfort, only a deeper, more profound chill that seemed to seep into Leo's bones. He had spent the night curled in the tomb of his home, but sleep had been a shallow, haunted thing, a river of nightmares filled with slamming gates and his mother's fading whispers. With the first weak grey light of dawn, a new and terrible clarity arrived. The ember of defiance that had carried him this far had been starved of oxygen in the suffocating darkness of his memories. Now, all that remained was the cold ash of survival. He was hungry. It was a pain that had become his constant companion, a dull, gnawing ache that had sharpened into a predatory beast inside him. He had to eat. The thought was no longer tied to hope or a future. It was a simple mechanical command from a body that refused to quit, even if his spirit already had. He pushed himself to his feet, his joints cracking in protest. The world outside the ruins was pale and washed out, the sun not yet strong enough to bake the color back into the land. He knew where he had to go. The village. It was a place of ghosts and closed doors, but it was also the only place where the carelessness of others might offer a scrap of life. With his head down, a small, hunched figure against the vast, empty landscape, he began the walk back toward the world of men. Each step was an argument with himself. One part of him, the part that still held the echo of his father's pride, screamed at the indignity of it. The other, the feral, starving part, simply propelled him forward. He was no longer Leo Martin, son of Ricardo and Elena. He was a stray drawn by the distant scent of food, his identity stripped away by a need so basic it erased everything else. He reached the edge of the village as the sun began to assert its authority, casting long, sharp shadows from the adobe houses. The air was already starting to shimmer with heat. People were beginning to stir, their movements slow and deliberate, conserving energy for the long, hot day ahead. They saw him, a smudge of dirt and rags at the periphery of their vision, and a familiar, subtle shift occurred. Shoulders tightened, gazes were averted, conversations dropped to a murmur. He was a bad omen, a walking reminder of the fragility of their own existence. He approached the first house, the home of the Garcias, where the memory of a shared meal and his mother's laughter felt like a cruel joke. He didn't knock this time. He just stood near the back, where the family's meager trash pile was kept, his eyes scanning for anything edible. The back door creaked open. It was Mrs. Garcia, her face already lined with the day's worries. She saw him, and for a moment a flicker of something soft and human crossed her features. It was pity, raw and undeniable. But then her eyes darted nervously toward the street, toward the other houses, toward the distant silhouette of the Andrade ranch on the hill. Fear was a stronger, more practical emotion. It extinguished the pity in an instant. Her face hardened into a mask of strained indifference. "Go away, boy," she said, her voice low and tight, not with malice but with a desperate need to protect her own. "There is nothing for you here. You'll bring trouble." She tossed a bucket of dirty water onto the dust near his feet, a gesture of cleansing, of washing away his unwanted presence. The door clicked shut, and the bolt slid home with a heavy, final thud. It was a sound he was becoming all too familiar with, the sound of a world locking him out. He turned away, the shame a hot flush on his neck. He hadn't even asked for anything, yet he had been refused. His very existence was the plea, and it was a plea the world was tired of hearing. He continued down the dusty alleyway between the houses, his hunger now a sharp, twisting knife in his belly. A group of children, a little older than him, were playing a game with stones in the shade of a gnarled, leafless tree. They stopped when they saw him. Their initial curiosity quickly curdled into the casual cruelty that children learn from the whispers of their parents. One of them, a boy with a swagger that mimicked the ranch hands, picked up a clod of dry dirt. "Look," he sneered, "it's the dust ghost. They say his father ran away because he was afraid of a little hard work." The other children giggled, a harsh, nervous sound. "My papa says the Martins were lazy," another one chimed in. "That's why the land spit them out." The first boy hurled the clod of dirt. It hit Leo in the shoulder, exploding in a small puff of brown. It didn't hurt, not physically, but it was a new kind of blow, a confirmation of the stories he'd overheard. They were not just ignoring his family's tragedy, they were rewriting it, turning it into a fable of failure to make themselves feel safer, stronger. He didn't run, he didn't cry out. He just stood there, taking it, as more small handfuls of dust and pebbles were thrown in his direction. He was a statue of shame. Each piece of dirt that hit him felt like a word, hammering home the new truth of his life. Lazy, worthless, ghost. He was becoming the story they told about him. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever felt the weight of other people's words trying to define you, trying to shrink you down into a simple, ugly story that makes them feel better about themselves? It is a prison built of whispers, a cage whose bars are forged from judgment and fear. To fight back is to confirm their aggression. To stay silent is to accept their definition. For a boy of 10, there was no right answer. There was only the sting of the dust in his eyes and the slow, crushing realization that he was utterly, terribly alone. The children eventually grew bored of their sport and wandered off, leaving him standing in the alley, coated in a fresh layer of humiliation. The world had made its verdict clear. He was not a boy, he was a problem. He was not hungry, he was a nuisance. He was not grieving, he was an inconvenience. The beast of hunger, however, did not care about verdicts or social dynamics. It roared, demanding to be fed. He found his way to the back of the small cantina, where the smells of stale beer and cooking oil hung heavy in the air. Here the trash pile was larger, a small mountain of hope and disgust. He began to pick through it, his small hands sifting through refuse, his pride a distant, luxurious memory he could no longer afford. And that is when he saw it, a piece of hardened bread, discarded but mostly intact. He reached for it, his fingers trembling with anticipation, but another creature had gotten there first. A skinny, mangy dog with ribs showing through its patchy fur had the bread in its mouth, its eyes low and growling, a warning in its throat. For a long moment, boy and dog stared at each other. They were rivals, two starving outcasts locked in a battle for the same pathetic prize. In the dog's desperate, fearful eyes, Leo saw a perfect reflection of himself, stripped of name, of family, of home. What was he but a two-legged animal, scavenging for survival on the fringes of a world that had no use for him? The dog was more honest about it, at least. It didn't pretend to be anything else. The realization broke something deep inside him. He backed away slowly, surrendering the bread. The dog snatched its prize and scurried away into the shadows. Leo sank to the ground, his back against the hot adobe wall, the fight finally draining out of him. He had lost a battle for a scrap of trash to a stray dog. The foreman's spit, the closed doors, the children's taunts, they were all abstractions of cruelty. This was the reality. This was the bottom. As if the universe wanted to underscore his defeat, a new sound cut through the midday stupor of the village. The clatter of horse hooves on the hard-packed earth. Leo looked up and saw a rider approaching. It was Silas, the ranch foreman, his figure imposing on a tall, dark horse. He was moving through the village with an air of proprietary ownership, as if he were a king surveying his domain. The villagers reacted instantly. Men tipped their hats. Women offered nervous smiles. The fear that had been a subtle undercurrent in the air now became a palpable, suffocating wave. Silas was the embodiment of Colonel Andrade's power, the hand that could give or take away, and everyone knew it. Silas reined in his horse near the cantina, not 20 feet from where Leo sat, hidden in the shadows. He didn't seem to notice the boy. At first, his cold, flat eyes scanned the street, taking in the subservient postures of the villagers with a faint, contemptuous smirk. He was enjoying this. He was a man who had nothing, who was nothing, without the borrowed power of the Andrade name, and he savored every drop of fear he could wring from these people. Then his eyes found Leo. The smirk on his face widened into a genuine, cruel smile. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just looked at Leo, a long, deliberate gaze that took in the boy's filthy clothes, his slumped posture against the garbage pile, his utter defeat. The look was 1,000 words long. It said, "This is where you belong. This is what you are. Dirt. Less than the dog that just ran from you. I did this to you." It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph for him, and a moment of absolute annihilation for Leo. Silas nudged his horse and rode on, leaving a trail of dust and silent terror in his wake. The villagers slowly relaxed, the air becoming breathable again. But for Leo, the air had been stolen from his lungs. He had seen the face of the man who had started his downward spiral, and that man had been pleased with his work. It was the final, crushing blow. The world wasn't just indifferent to his suffering, it actively celebrated it. His pain was a source of pleasure for the powerful. His degradation was a testament to their strength. The fight was over. They had won. He understood now. His mother's words about the land remembering, his father's lessons about dignity, they were all beautiful lies. They were stories for a world that no longer existed. In this world, the only truth was power, and he had none. Slowly, like an old man, he got to his feet. He was done with the village. He was done with the world of men. There was only one place left to go. He turned his back on the houses, on the averted eyes and the cruel whispers, and began the long walk back to the ruins of his home. But he was not going back for shelter. He was not going back to cling to memories. He was a soldier leaving the battlefield, not in retreat but in surrender. He was going back to the place where his family's story had ended to write his own final sentence. He would lie down in the dust that had birthed him, the same dust that had claimed his mother, and he would wait. He would let the thirst and the hunger and the crushing weight of his own insignificance finally finish their work. He would become what everyone already believed he was, a ghost, a forgotten whisper on a dry wind. As he walked, the sun beat down on his back, but for the first time, he welcomed its merciless heat. It was a fire, and he was ready to be consumed by it. He arrived back at the ruins as the sun reached its zenith, a merciless white eye in a bleached sky. The walk had been a funeral march, and he was both the mourner and the deceased. Every step back to this place of endings was a conscious act of surrender. The world did not want him. It had made this clear in every conceivable way, with a gate of iron, with a glob of spit, with closed doors, with hurled clods of dirt, with the growl of a starving dog. He had fought in his own quiet way by simply continuing to exist. But that fight was over. There was no more fuel for the fire. He was a ghost now, and he had come home to haunt the only place that would have him. He stepped over the fallen threshold, the dust rising to greet him like a long-lost relative. This time, there were no echoes of his mother's songs, no phantom scent of his father's pipe tobacco. The memories had been burned away by the harsh glare of his reality, leaving only the sterile, silent bones of what used to be. He moved through the skeletal remains of the rooms, his bare feet stirring the settled dust of years. He was not looking for anything. He was simply moving toward the center of the decay, drawn to the hearth, the place that had once been the warm, beating heart of his family. The stones were Cold now, a crude altar to a god of hunger and neglect. He sank to the ground beside it, his small body folding in on itself, a final weary collapse. He leaned his back against the crumbling remains of the kitchen wall, the rough adobe scratching his thin shirt. The wind, his only companion, whispered through the broken rafters, a sound so desolate it seemed to be the voice of loneliness itself. He closed his eyes. He would not get up again. He would let the sun and the thirst and the silence do their work. He would become one with the dust. It was a strangely peaceful thought, the first moment of peace he had felt all day, the peace of absolute surrender. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, drifting in a hazy state between consciousness and oblivion. The world was fading to a low hum. Then, a sound. Not the wind, but a sharp, cracking noise from beneath him, like old bones snapping. Before he could process it, the ground gave way. There was a sickening lurch, a brief, terrifying sensation of weightlessness, and then he was falling. He landed with a hard jolt on a surface that was not dust, but something cool and firm. The fall was short, only a few feet, but it had plunged him into absolute darkness. Dust and splinters of rotten wood rained down on him from the jagged hole where he had just been sitting. For a moment, he was paralyzed by shock, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had not come here to die this way, swallowed by a sudden, unexpected maw in the earth. He had come for a slow, quiet fade, and the land itself had violently rejected his plan. As his eyes slowly, painfully adjusted to the gloom, he realized where he was. He was in a small subterranean space, a cellar. It was no more than a pit dug out of the earth, reinforced with stone, a place his parents had never once mentioned. The air was different down here. It was cool, almost damp, and carried the rich, loamy scent of deep earth, a smell he hadn't experienced since he was a small child. It was the smell of life, of possibility, trapped beneath a world of death. It was as if the drought that had scorched the surface had never touched this hidden sanctuary. He pushed himself up, his limbs trembling. The hole he fell through was a ragged patch of grey light above him. He was in the secret underbelly of his own home, a place he never knew existed. He felt a strange, primal fear mixed with an inexplicable curiosity. He had fallen through the floor of his despair and landed in a place of secrets. His gaze swept the small space and he saw it. Tucked into a corner, almost completely obscured by shadows, was a small, dark shape. It was a wooden chest, bound with rusted iron straps. It was not large, but it had an aura of importance, of deliberate concealment. It was covered in a thick mantle of dust and cobwebs, a treasure chest for spiders and time. A new feeling, one he hadn't felt in a very long time, began to stir in his chest. A flicker of something that was not quite hope, but a powerful magnetic pull. He shuffled toward it, his bare feet silent on the cool, packed earth floor. He knelt before the chest, his fingers tracing the rough grain of the ancient wood. There was no lock, only a simple iron latch, rusted shut by decades of subterranean silence. With a surge of adrenaline, he pried at it with his small, grimy fingers. The metal groaned in protest. Then, with a final screeching pop, it gave way. He lifted the heavy lid. The air that escaped from within was stale, carrying the scent of dried paper and leather. His first feeling was a pang of childish disappointment. He had imagined gold or perhaps a hidden stash of food. Instead, the chest was filled with papers, maps, and, resting on top of it all, a single thick, leather-bound journal. It was old, the leather cracked and worn smooth at the edges. He lifted it out. It was surprisingly heavy, dense with the weight of its contents. He ran his thumb over the cover, and on the front, faintly embossed in the leather, he could just make out a name, Elias Martin, his great-grandfather. A man he knew only from a single faded photograph and his father's brief, proud stories. This was a direct link, a tangible piece of the history that he thought had been erased. He was holding a piece of his own story that he never knew had been written. He knew he couldn't read it in the oppressive darkness of the cellar. He had to get back to the light. He scrambled back to the opening. The journal clutched tightly to his chest and with some effort pulled himself out of the hole and back into the dying light of the afternoon. He sat near the collapsed doorway, the sun now casting long, gentle shadows, and opened the book. The pages were brittle, the color of old ivory. The ink was a faded brown, the script an elegant looping cursive that was difficult for his young eyes to decipher. But he persisted, his brow furrowed in concentration. The first pages were filled with daily observations about the farm, notes on planting seasons, the price of grain, the birth of a calf. It was the simple, honest diary of a man who loved his land. But as he turned the pages, the entries began to change. They became more technical, filled with strange diagrams, measurements of depth and notes on rock formations. Then he found it, a series of hand-drawn maps of their property, but they were unlike any maps he had ever seen. They showed the familiar contours of the hills, the location of the old farmhouse, the creek that had long since run dry. But beneath the surface of the land, his great-grandfather had drawn something else, a thick, blue line, snaking its way deep underground. It was labeled in the same elegant script, the River of Shadow. The journal entries that followed explained everything. Elias Martin, a man with a keen, self-taught understanding of geology, had discovered a powerful underground aquifer, a hidden river flowing deep beneath their land. It was a secret he guarded jealously, a gift from the earth that he believed was his family's sacred trust and their insurance against any drought the sky might send. He had written it all down, a legacy for his children, a secret to be passed from one generation of Martin to the next. Leo's hands began to shake, the brittle pages trembling. He flipped forward, his eyes scanning the text with a new, frantic urgency. He found the last chilling entry. His great-grandfather wrote of the arrival of a new neighbor, a wealthy man from the city named Andrade, who had bought the adjacent property. He wrote of Andrade's unnatural curiosity about the Martins' consistent good fortune with their well, even in dry seasons. The final map in the book was a horrifying revelation. It showed the blue line of the hidden river flowing directly from the Martin property and continuing under the new boundary line, straight toward a location on the Andrade land, marked with a large, crude X. And next to it, say a final, hastily scrawled note from Elias Martin. He knows. I fear he means to steal the heart of our land from the darkness below. And then the journal ended. The truth, delivered across a chasm of 70 years, struck Leo with the force of a physical blow. The drought hadn't been a natural disaster. It was a theft. The Andrades hadn't found water. They had drilled sideways, tapping into the secret river, siphoning the lifeblood from beneath his family's feet, leaving them to wither and die. On the surface, while they built an empire on stolen water, his mother's words echoed in his mind, no longer a poetic whisper, but a thunderous prophecy. The truth is in the dirt. And he had found it. The boy who had collapsed in these ruins just hours ago, a creature of pure despair, was gone. In his place was someone else, someone forged in the cool, dark earth of a hidden cellar and baptized in the faded ink of a stolen legacy. The shame that had coated him, the hunger that had hollowed him out, it was all burned away by a white-hot surge of righteous fury. He was not the son of a failure. He was the heir to a great secret and the victim of a great crime. He held the proof in his hands. This fragile book was not just his family's story. It was a weapon. It was the truth, and it was more powerful than any iron gate, any cruel foreman, any rich colonel. And what about you? If you held in your hands the undeniable proof of a wrong that had destroyed your family, that had defined your entire life as a tragedy, what would you do? If you were just one small forgotten boy against an empire of lies, would you have the courage to face them all, knowing they had the power to crush you like an insect? Leo stood up. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the colors of a fresh bruise. But for the first time he did not see it as an omen of another dark night. He saw it as a fire, and it matched the one now blazing in his own heart. He looked across the darkening valley toward the Andrade ranch. Lights were beginning to twinkle on in the great house on the hill, each one a tiny, arrogant star of stolen prosperity. He had heard the whispers in the village. Colonel Andrade was hosting a grand party in a few days' time, a celebration of his wealth and power, a feast in the middle of a famine. Leo clutched the journal to his chest, its hard corners pressing into his ribs like armor. He would not hide. He would not run. He would walk back to that gate, but he would not be a beggar this time. He would be a reckoning. He did not know exactly what would happen, but he knew his story was not over. The clang of that gate had not been an ending. It had been a declaration of war. And what was coming was not just another day of survival, but the night that would change the history of the entire valley forever. The walk back to the Andrade ranch was not the journey of a beggar. It was the procession of a king returning to reclaim a stolen kingdom, though his throne was a patch of dust and his crown was a memory of injustice. Leo walked not with the shuffle of a defeated child, but with the measured, deliberate steps of a man who knows his purpose. The leather-bound journal was held not like a shield, but like a scepter, its weight in his hands a constant grounding reminder of the truth he now carried. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the clouds in violent hues of crimson and gold, the colors of a revolution, and every ray of that dying light seemed to sharpen the new, hard edges of his resolve. He was no longer a ghost haunted by the past. He was the past's avenging angel, a small boy with the weight of 3 generations of Martin's sweat and sorrow propelling him forward. The dust that rose with each footfall was not the dust of shame, but the dust of his ancestors, rising up to march with him. As he drew closer, the sounds began to reach him. Not the oppressive silence of his first visit, but the tinkling of music, the murmur of polite laughter, the clinking of glasses. It was the sound of a world utterly detached from the suffering that surrounded it, a party on a sinking ship, a feast in a graveyard. The sounds did not intimidate him. They fueled the fire in his belly, turning his righteous anger into a cold, focused point of light. He saw the gate, the same monolithic barrier of black iron, but it no longer looked impossibly large. It looked fragile, like a cage made of shadows, because he now understood that the true prison was not being locked out, but being locked in with a lie. He walked directly to the smaller pedestrian gate, and without hesitation, he struck it with his open palm. The sound was not loud, but it was sharp, a single defiant crack that cut through the festive air. The gate creaked open, and there he was, Silas. The foreman's face, illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns hanging within the courtyard, went through a rapid series of expressions. First, a flicker of confusion, then a sneer, of contemptuous recognition, and finally a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. The sight of this boy, this piece of human refuse he had personally discarded, returning to his doorstep, was an affront to the natural order of his world. He saw the dirt on Leo's face, the rags on his body, but he missed the fundamental change in the boy's eyes. He saw a beggar, not a reckoning. He let out a low, guttural laugh, a sound like grinding stones. What more could this whelp possibly want? Had he not learned his lesson? Silas took a step forward, his shadow falling over Leo like a shroud. He loomed, a mountain of casual cruelty, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He did not intend to speak this time. Words were for equals. A shove had not been enough. This time the lesson would be more permanent, a message written in bruises that would ensure the boy never dared to show his face here again. He was the gatekeeper of this paradise, and his job was to crush anything that threatened its perfect, orderly illusion. This boy was a weed, a piece of blight that had somehow grown back, and it was his duty to rip it out by the roots and salt the earth where it had stood. He raised a hand, the calloused knuckles like a row of stones, ready to strike the boy down and put an end to this absurd interruption. But before the blow could land, Leo spoke. His voice was not the dry, pleading rasp of a thirsty child. It was clear, steady, and it rang with an authority that seemed to come from the very ground beneath his feet. It was a voice that stopped the foreman's hand in midair. He did not shout, but his words carried across the courtyard, slicing through the music and the laughter, reaching the ears of the finely dressed guests who were mingling on the veranda. He held up the journal, its worn leather cover facing outward like a declaration, and he said the words that would shatter the world. He said, "The water you celebrate tonight is stolen. It belongs to my family. It belongs to this land, and I have the proof." The effect was instantaneous. A profound, unnatural silence fell over the party. The music from a distant gramophone seemed to stutter and die. Laughter was frozen in throats. Conversations were cut off mid-sentence. Dozens of faces, pale and curious in the lantern light, turned as one toward the source of this impossible proclamation. They saw the scene at the gate, the hulking, furious foreman, his hand still raised, and before him, a small, defiant child clutching a tattered book. The contrast was so stark, so unbelievable, that it held them all in a state of suspended animation. It was a moment of pure theatrical tension, a crack in the polished veneer of their comfortable reality. Out of this tableau of frozen disbelief, a figure emerged from the main house, stepping onto the veranda. It was Colonel Andrade himself. He was a man accustomed to absolute control, his presence alone enough to command obedience. He was dressed in a pristine, white suit that seemed to glow in the evening light, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. His face, usually a mask of pleasant, aristocratic condescension, was tight with annoyance at this disruption of his carefully orchestrated event. He looked at the scene, his eyes flicking from Silas to the small boy, and a frown of distaste creased his brow. He did not see a threat. He saw an embarrassment, a piece of local squalor that had somehow wandered into his pristine world. He took a slow, deliberate sip from his glass, a gesture designed to communicate his utter lack of concern, his complete and total command of the situation. "Silas," the colonel's voice was smooth, but with an undercurrent of cold steel. "Remove this disturbance." Quietly. It was an order for an execution, cloaked in the language of housekeeping, but Silas for the first time hesitated. He was caught between the colonel's command and the unnerving, unshakable confidence in the boy's eyes. The entire party was watching. This was no longer a private act of cruelty in the dust. This was a public stage. Leo did not flinch. He did not back down. He took a step forward into the light spilling from the courtyard, holding the journal higher. "My name is Leo Martin," he announced, his voice growing stronger, feeding on the silence and the focused attention of the crowd. "Son of Ricardo Martin, grandson of Samuel Martin. This book was written by my great-grandfather, Elias Martin, on the land that you now call worthless, the land you left to die." Colonel Andrade's face began to lose its carefully constructed calm. The name Martin had struck a chord, a faint, discordant note from a past he had worked so hard to bury. He set his glass down on the railing with a sharp click. "I have no idea what this nonsense is about," he said, his voice losing its smoothness, taking on a sharper, more dangerous edge. The Martin land was abandoned, a victim of the drought like so many others. A tragedy, but one, of nature's making. He was trying to regain control of the narrative, to paint the boy as a delusional orphan, a peddler of sad fantasies. He was using the power of his reputation, the weight of his wealth, to crush the boy's story before it could take root. "It was not nature," Leo's voice rang out clear and true. "It was theft." He opened the journal, his small fingers fumbling for a moment with the brittle pages until he found the one he was looking for, the hand-drawn map. Yet, great-grandfather discovered a river under our land. A river of shadow, he called it. He wrote it all down, he mapped its path, a path that flows from our soil directly to the place where you dug your first miracle well. You didn't find water, Colonel. You drilled into our legacy. You siphoned the life from beneath our feet and left my family to choke on the dust while you built this green paradise on top of our stolen water. Each word was an indictment, a stone cast with perfect aim, and the facade of Colonel Andrade began to visibly crack. A murmur rippled through the crowd of guests. They were wealthy landowners, businessmen from the city, people who understood contracts and property lines and the ruthless acquisition of resources. They were looking at the colonel now with new eyes, not as a gracious host, but as a potential charlatan. The boy's story, as wild as it sounded, had the undeniable ring of truth, the kind of simple, brutal explanation that makes a complex mystery suddenly clear. The perpetual green of the Andrade Ranch in the middle of a decade-long drought had always been a source of wonder and envy. Now, it was beginning to look like evidence of a crime. And you, watching this unfold, have you ever been in that position? To stand before a powerful liar, someone everyone else respects and fears, and to speak a truth they are determined to silence. It is a terrifying moment, to be one small voice against a chorus of accepted falsehoods. It requires a courage that comes not from the head, but from a place so deep in the soul that it is unbreakable. Colonel Andrade took a step forward, his face a mask of cold fury. The pretense of civility was gone. "This is libel," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "This is the pathetic fantasy of a street rat looking for a handout. You have no proof, only the scribblings of a dead man in a moldy book." He was cornered, and like a cornered animal, he was becoming vicious. He was about to give the order, again to have both the boy and his book removed, to have this entire incident erased from history, when another voice spoke from the edge of the crowd. It was a voice cracked with age, but steady with conviction. "The boy speaks the truth." All heads turned. An old man, his face a road map of the region's hardships, stepped out of the shadows. It was Mateo, a farmer whose own small plot of land had withered to dust years ago. He was one of the few villagers who had been invited, not as a guest, but to help with the manual labor of the party, a silent, invisible servant. But he was invisible no more. He walked slowly toward the center of the courtyard, his old, tired eyes fixed on Colonel Andrade. "I remember Elias Martin," Mateo said, his voice gaining strength with every word. "I was just a boy myself. Everyone knew the Martins had a gift. Their well never ran dry, not even in the worst of times. We all thought it was a blessing. Then your father arrived, Colonel, and soon after, the Martin well went dry for the first time in memory, and your well, the one you dug so close to their property line, became a miracle. We were all so desperate for water. We chose not to ask questions. We chose to believe in your miracle instead of our neighbor's misfortune." Mateo's testimony was a lightning strike. It was the corroboration, the living memory that connected the faded ink of the journal to the bitter reality of the present. It transformed Leo's accusation from a personal grievance into a communal history of injustice. The guests were no longer just spectators, they were witnesses. The foundation of Andrade's power, built on the community's fear and their willful ignorance, was crumbling before their eyes. The colonel was speechless, his face ashen. He looked from Leo to Mateo, two ghosts from a past he thought he had successfully buried, now standing in the full light of his stolen glory, demanding a reckoning. Silas, seeing his master's authority disintegrate, finally snapped. His loyalty was not to the man, but to the power the man wielded, and that power was now threatened. With a roar of pure rage, he lunged at Leo, his intention clear: to seize the book, to destroy the evidence, to silence the source of this catastrophe. But he never reached him. Several of the villagers who had been working the party, including Mateo's own sons, moved as one. They stepped in front of Leo, forming a human wall. They were no longer cowed servants. They were men who had just been reminded of their own long-suppressed dignity. Silas skidded to a halt, faced with the stony, determined faces of men he had lorded over for years. He looked at them, then back at the pale, defeated face of his colonel, and he understood. The power was gone. The illusion was shattered. Without a word, he turned and melted back into the shadows, a coward deserting a fallen king. The journal was passed from hand to hand among the guests. They examined the map, they read the entries, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. The evidence was irrefutable, written in the steady hand of a man documenting his own slow execution. Colonel Andrade stood alone on his veranda, a statue of a powerful man, his empire of lies reduced to a single, moldy book in the hands of a barefoot boy. He did not rage, he did not plead, he simply seemed to shrink, the arrogance and authority draining out of him, leaving behind only a hollow, defeated shell. The party was over. The guests began to leave, not with the cheerful goodbyes of a festive evening, but with the quiet, awkward footsteps of people fleeing the scene of a terrible discovery. They left Colonel Andrade alone in his house of stolen water, a prisoner in his own fraudulent paradise. The next morning, the sun rose on a different world. The news of what had happened at the Andrade ranch spread through the village like a cleansing fire. It was a story told in hushed, excited whispers that grew into bold, open conversations. Hope, an emotion that had been as scarce as water, began to bubble up from the dry earth. Led by Mateo, a procession of villagers, armed with old shovels and a newfound sense of purpose, made their way to the ruins of the Martin farm. Leo walked at their head, not as a leader but as a guide, the keeper of the map. He led them to the spot marked in his great-grandfather's journal, a barren patch of ground behind the collapsed hearth. And then they began to dig. It was hard, grueling work. The earth was packed and dry, as hard as stone on the surface. For hours they dug, their shovels striking the ground in a steady, rhythmic beat, a drumbeat of collective will. Doubt began to creep in. The sun was high and hot. Sweat stung their eyes. What if it was all a story? What if the old man's mind had played tricks on him? But they looked at Leo, sitting quietly by the growing pit, the journal open on his lap, his face a mask of serene certainty, and they found new strength. They dug deeper past the dry topsoil into a layer of cooler, darker earth. The smell of the air began to change, becoming thick with the scent of damp soil, the long-forgotten perfume of life. Then it happened. A shovel, wielded by one of Mateo's sons, struck something that was not rock. It was a soft, sucking sound. He lifted the shovel, and the earth that came with it was not dust, but thick, dark mud. A collective gasp went through the crowd. They scrambled to the edge of the pit. their eyes wide with disbelief and anticipation. Another shovelful, and then another, and then a small muddy trickle of water began to seep from the bottom of the hole. It was just a trickle, but to these people, it was an ocean. And then, with a low subterranean groan, the ground seemed to swell, and a powerful gush of fresh, clear water erupted from the earth. It was not a trickle, it was a torrent. It was a river, the river of shadow, bursting forth into the light after a lifetime of darkness. A roar of pure, unadulterated joy went up from the villagers. They laughed, they shouted, they embraced each other. Men who hadn't smiled in years wept openly, letting the tears of relief mix with the spray from the newly born spring. Children who had only ever known a world of dust and thirst splashed in the growing pools, their shrieks of delight a sound of pure magic. They scooped the water up in their cupped hands, drinking deeply, washing the grime from their faces. It was a baptism. It was a resurrection. It was the land itself finally breathing again after being suffocated for so long. Justice was not an abstract concept delivered in a courtroom. It was this cold, clean water flowing over their hands, a tangible, life-giving absolution. Leo stood apart from the celebration, watching. He knelt down and dipped his hands into the water, the same water he had been denied, the water that had cost his family everything. It was cool and real. He brought his hands to his face and drank, and it was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. It was the taste of his mother's songs, of his father's pride, of his great-grandfather's wisdom. It was the taste of home. The river he had carried inside him, a heavy burden of memory and grief, was now flowing free outside of him for everyone. He felt the weight lift from his small shoulders, a profound, quiet release that was more powerful than all the joyous shouting around him. He was no longer the boy who carried the river. He was the boy who had set it free. In the weeks and months that followed, the valley was transformed. A system of irrigation channels was built, designed not to hoard the water, but to share it, carrying life to all the small farms that had been left to die. The land so long dormant began to heal. Patches of green appeared, then fields of corn and beans. The village, once a place of fear and suspicion, became a community of cooperation, their shared effort in unearthing the water, binding them together in a way that their shared suffering never could. The Andrade Ranch, now cut off from its stolen source, began to wither. Its perfect green lawns turned yellow, then brown. Colonel Andrade became a recluse, a ghost haunting the halls of his dying oasis, a living monument to the truth that a life built on a lie will eventually turn to dust. Leo did not become a new colonel. He did not seek power or wealth. He reclaimed his family's land, but he saw himself not as its owner, but as its guardian, the keeper of the spring that now belonged to everyone. He rebuilt his home not as it was, but as a smaller, simpler house, with the help of the entire village. The doors that had once been closed to him were now always open. The people who had once averted their gazes now looked at him with a mixture of respect and affection. He was no longer the dust ghost. He was Leo Martin, the boy who had reminded them all of the taste of water and the even sweeter taste of courage. He had been denied a single cup, and in return he had given them an entire river. And so the story of the boy and the gate comes to its close. But it is a story that echoes far beyond this one small, dusty valley. How many times in our own lives do we stand before a closed gate? How often are we judged, dismissed and told that we are worth less than the ground another person spits on? We are told that the world is the way it is, that the powerful will always win, that the truth is a luxury we cannot afford. We are encouraged to believe in the convenient lies that maintain a comfortable order, rather than seek the difficult truths that could set us all free. Leo's story is a reminder that the most profound power does not lie in wealth or in walls of iron. It lies in the courage to speak the truth, even when your voice is shaking. It lies in the knowledge that justice, like a hidden river, may be buried deep, but it never truly disappears. It is always there, waiting for someone brave enough to start digging. The world will always have its foremen, its colonels, its gates designed to keep the worthy in and the needy out. But it will also have its Leos. It will have those who, armed with nothing but the truth of their own history, dare to walk back to the gate not to beg, but to demand a reckoning. Every great change, every toppled empire of lies, begins with a single voice refusing to be silenced, a single person who understands that the deepest truths are often found not in the palaces of the powerful, but buried in the dirt beneath our own feet. This story is a testament to the enduring power of a single, defiant human spirit to change the world, not by carrying a river of water, but by carrying a river of truth. If this story of a world turned upside down, of justice unearthed from the dust, has spoken to a part of your own journey, if you have ever felt trapped by a judgment that was not yours to carry, or if you have ever found the strength to face your own gate, let us know in the comments. There is a powerful connection in shared stories of resilience. Write down, I have also experienced a turning point. Because in every life, there is a moment when the floor gives way, and we have the choice to either be buried by the fall or to discover the truth that was waiting for us in the dark.